Sergeant Alicia Thompson is standing in the jet bridge, her polished black boots clicking lightly against the floor plates as she waits for the cabin door to close. She is wearing her dress uniform, the olive green jacket neatly pressed, the silver rank stripes on her sleeve catching the overhead lights. Her chest is quiet with resolve, because she has done everything right. She is heading home after a year overseas, and for the first time in months, her heart feels like it might actually slow down. The last thing she expects is confrontation. She is one of the few passengers boarding last before takeoff, her first-class ticket clasped between her fingers like a lifeline. Her father, Commander Robert Thompson, arranged it weeks ago. She has been looking forward to slipping into that wide leather seat, closing her eyes and forgetting the world for a while. Instead, she is about to learn how quickly respect can be stripped away. Alicia steps into the cabin, taking in the plush tan tones and the quiet hum of the engines. The air smells faintly of leather conditioner and strong coffee in those small 12-ounce cups they hand out up front. She glances down the aisle, spotting seat 3A right by the window, exactly where her father wanted her. Her mind drifts for a second to home. Her mother with her apron on, humming while she bakes cornbread. She can almost taste that warm loaf. She imagines her dog wagging its tail against her legs, the screen door creaking as she steps in. That image is her reward for every long night in uniform. She steadies herself and moves forward, folding her backpack neatly before tucking it beneath the seat. Everything feels perfect until the smile fades. That is when Patricia Caldwell appears. She is the lead flight attendant, tall and with her ash-brown hair pulled into a tight bun at the back of her head. Her posture is rigid, and she carries a clipboard that seems more like a weapon than a tool. Patricia's eyes flick from Alicia's dog tags to her badge and back again, narrowing as if spotting a mistake. Alicia offers a polite nod because she believes courtesy will calm any tension. Patricia Caldwell waits a beat before she speaks. "May I see your boarding pass?" she says in a tone that is cordial but brittle underneath. Alicia nods again and slides the ticket across the armrest. The moment Patricia takes it, every passenger in first class seems to glance up, phones hovering like tiny spotlights. Patricia studies the pass and then Alicia's uniform. The corners of her mouth twitch in a way that feels rehearsed. She glances back at the boarding pass, then back at Alicia and says, "This is a first-class seat." Alicia's voice trembles just enough when she replies, "Yes, ma'am, that is where I sit." Patricia checks the numbers again, then sets the clipboard on her forearm and lowers her voice. "There must be a mix-up. You will need to move to the back of the plane." Alicia's eyebrows lift, surprise flashing across her face. "My father purchased this ticket for me. It is valid," she says calmly. Patricia shakes her head, her tone shifting to something sharper. "I understand that, but this is not standard. I need you to come with me." The moment feels surreal. Patricia reaches out, placing her hand on Alicia's arm and pushing gently, just hard enough to remind her who holds the power in that space. Alicia freezes for a heartbeat, her uniform jacket stiff against her chest. A hush falls over first class so complete that Alicia can hear her own breath. She can feel dozens of eyes on her, some curious, many silent. No one moves. No one offers to speak up in her defense. Instead, she allows herself a small nod and stands. Her shoulders stay squared, but the weight of the stare from other passengers feels like 1,000 lead bricks. She gathers her jacket, drapes her backpack over her shoulder, and begins to walk down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. Walking past those marble-like bulkheads, Alicia feels the humiliation tighten her lungs. Each step toward economy is like walking backward through time, erasing every bit of the service and sacrifice that earned her those stripes. Passengers whisper behind their hands, but no one meets her gaze. She tries not to look down at the cheap blue seats waiting for her at the back. When she reaches economy, she picks the emptiest row she can find. Seat 21C, wedged between two people glued to their tablets. She lowers herself into the cramped space and straightens, her back ramrod straight even though the cushion feels like plywood. The tray table squeaks under her elbow, and she can already feel the stiffness setting into her shoulders. She reaches into her backpack and pulls out her phone. Her fingers hover over the screen before she types a message to her father. "They told me I don't belong in first class. They made me move to economy. They touched my arm. I'm okay, but I'm upset." She hits send and then turns the phone face down on her lap so that the bright screen does not betray the worry she feels. She stares straight ahead at the seat back in front of her, letting the engine drone fill her ears even though her mind is racing. The pain is not in the downgrade itself. It is in the instant erasure of her dignity that happened in front of so many people, as if her uniform meant nothing. Her phone vibrates. A reply pops up immediately. "What is your flight number?" Her father's words are curt. He is a man who knows the inner workings of systems, military, federal, and airline alike. When he asks that question, Alicia understands that something is about to unfold. She types back, "Flight 227," then presses send and turns her attention back to the tiny window beside her. Outside, the sky is a pale ribbon of blue fading into clouds. The landing gear has retracted, and at 35,000 feet, she feels the gentle lift of the wings. She breathes in, letting the cool cabin air steady her. Up in first class, Patricia Caldwell has returned to her duties as if nothing happened. She pours champagne into fluted glasses, smiles at premium passengers, and offers pillows folded just so. A younger attendant named Emily Davis hovers close, her eyes flicking toward the back of the plane. Eventually, Emily crosses the cabin, raising her whisper just loud enough for Patricia to hear. "Are you sure her ticket was wrong?" Emily asks hesitantly. Patricia rolls her eyes. "I saw someone once using a uniform to get an upgrade," she shrugs. "First class is for those who pay for it, not anyone in a costume." Emily looks uneasy, but she does not press further. She drifts away, leaving Patricia to her polished routine. Meanwhile, Alicia feels a knot tighten in her stomach. She knows better than to lose her temper. Instead, she rests her head against the window panel and closes her eyes. The seats closest to the galley are louder, full of passengers talking and clanking cups. She imagines her father pacing his office in Washington. He is Commander Robert Thompson, overseeing operations at the highest levels. When he gets involved, it means this is no small matter. She tucks a strand of hair behind her ear and waits. She trusts him to handle it, even though her heart pounds with every jolt of turbulence. Somewhere near the cockpit, the captain's cabin phone buzzes. Captain Michael Reynolds picks it up, glancing at the little illuminated sign beneath the control panel. A crisp, authoritative voice comes through. "This is Commander Robert Thompson," his father says. "I am calling about a passenger on flight 227. My daughter, Sergeant Alicia Thompson, was removed from her first-class seat unfairly." Captain Reynolds freezes for a moment, his fingers hovering over the intercom button. He straightens in his seat. "Yes, sir," he replies. "I was not aware of any—" The commander's voice overshadows him. "She was humiliated in front of other passengers, physically touched, and downgraded without cause. I have already been in contact with the Department of Aviation Security." The line goes dead before the captain can respond. The cockpit is silent except for the hum of the avionics. Captain Reynolds looks at his co-pilot, then reaches for the cabin intercom switch. Patricia Caldwell is halfway through greeting a passenger when the captain's voice comes over the speaker. "Lead flight attendant, report to the cockpit immediately." Patricia freezes with a glass of orange juice in her hand, confusion flickering across her face. She sets the glass down on the side console and walks briskly toward the cockpit door. Alicia hears the ring of the seatbelt sign chime in economy, an odd echo of the power shift in first class. In the cockpit, Patricia slides in and attempts her rehearsed smile. "You called for me, Captain?" she asks, voice pitched higher than usual. Captain Reynolds does not smile back. He fixes her with a steady gaze. "Do you recall seat 3A?" he asks. She nods, swallowing, her shoulders stiff. "The passenger you moved," he continues. "Did you verify her ticket and her identity?" Patricia glances at her clipboard, then back at him. "I checked the pass," she responds slowly. "It matched." The captain's eyes narrow. "Yet you still moved her. Why?" Patricia's voice wavers. "I thought it was an error. I believed someone might be using her uniform." Captain Reynolds leans forward. "That passenger is Sergeant Alicia Thompson, daughter of Commander Robert Thompson, who is overseeing defense operations at the national level. The Department of Aviation Security has escalated this issue." Patricia's face pales. The captain's voice is calm but firm. "You will go back to first class, apologize in front of the entire cabin, and escort her back to seat 3A. If her rights were violated, this flight may not continue to its destination." Patricia stands frozen for a moment, her heart racing. When she turns and leaves the cockpit, her steps are halting, as if the carpet might swallow her. A few minutes later, Alicia hears the gentle tap of heels approaching. She looks up to see Patricia Caldwell return to the aisle, her face pale and eyes cast downward. The lead attendant clears her throat and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to apologize for my earlier actions." Her voice quavers as she steps into the row where Alicia sits. "Sergeant Thompson, I am sorry for the way I treated you. Please come back to your seat." Patricia gestures toward first class, her shoulders slumped. The cabin falls silent, and for the first time those passengers who watched in silence 2 rows up look down at Alicia with something like respect. Alicia rises, her uniform impeccable despite everything. She nods to Patricia and walks back toward the front, each step reclaiming her dignity. She feels a ripple of murmurs and maybe even applause as she passes. When she reaches 3A, she turns to face the cabin. She sees faces softened by guilt and curiosity. She offers a small, calm smile and settles back into the wide leather seat that always felt like home, even in the air. As Patricia hands her a fresh glass of water in a clear 8-ounce tumbler, Alicia looks out the window at the endless horizon. She lifts the glass in a silent toast to every soldier who has ever faced unfair judgment. As the engines continue their steady roar, Alicia thinks of her father's disciplined calm and knows the rest of this flight will go smoothly. She will land at her hometown airport in a few hours, step off the plane into her mother's arms, and finally let herself breathe. But the memory of those first few minutes on this flight will remain a reminder that even the smallest act of prejudice can be powerful, and when you stand tall in the face of it, your strength becomes the real story. The cabin felt charged in a way Sergeant Alicia Thompson had never experienced, even in the heat of combat. The gentle hum of the engines and the muted chatter of passengers had receded into the background, replaced by an almost electric tension. Every eye in first class seemed to hover on her seat, but no one was brave enough to meet her gaze. Across the aisle, the leather seats that once felt like a sanctuary now pressed in on her, as though the very fabric had turned against her. Her uniform, once a symbol of honor, felt heavy, each wrinkle a reminder of the insult she endured. Karen Mitchell advanced down the center aisle with the stiffness of a condemned woman. Her hair, pulled back in its usual neat bun, now looked like a cage trapping her shame. She paused in front of seat 21C, crouching low so her voice would not carry beyond a whisper, but even in that hush, every head turned. "Sergeant Thompson," she began, "it appears there has been a misunderstanding." Her eyes darted to the rows behind Alicia, where flight attendants Emily Carter and 2 others hovered silently, their expressions a mixture of guilt and relief that the spotlight had shifted. Alicia lifted her chin, meeting Karen's gaze with a quiet fury that burned brighter than any artillery flare. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed, voice calm but so resonant that several passengers straightened in their seats. "You told me I didn't belong in first class, and you touched my arm." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through rows of stunned faces. Becky, the elderly woman in 2B, set down her half-finished champagne and seemed on the verge of speaking, only to catch herself and fold her hands tightly in her lap. Karen's throat worked as if she were trying to swallow that truth whole. She swallowed audibly, her voice catching at the start. "I'm sorry for the way I handled things," she said, each word heavy and deliberate. "I misread the manifest and She broke off, glancing at the manifest tucked under her clipboard, as though hoping it would absolve her. A few rows back, the tweed-jacketed gentleman leaned forward again, voice barely above a murmur. "I saw what happened," he confessed, "and it appalled me." Alicia glanced up, her head tilting slightly, and surprised him with a direct look. "Did you say anything when it happened?" she asked, voice soft but insistent. He shook his head, shame coloring his features. I didn't think it was my place," he admitted. Alicia's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "It always is," she replied. Her phone vibrated, cutting through the charged silence. She slid a fingertip across the screen. "Dad, good, I'm back. Security is waiting at the gate." She set the phone on the tray table, the glow illuminating her calm expression. Outside the window, the sky stretched in soft layers of gray and white, unremarkable but expansive, a contrast to the claustrophobic hush inside the cabin. Captain Reynolds's voice then came over the intercom, measured and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial approach. Please return to your seats and ensure all tray tables are in the upright position." He paused and then added in a neutral tone that only heightened the anticipation. "We appreciate your cooperation during what has been an unusual situation." Beyond the cabin walls, Emily Carter's earlier glance toward the cockpit had not gone unnoticed. Captain Reynolds and his co-pilot watched the descending flaps and consulted the approach plates, but their eyes betrayed a hint of satisfaction. They too understood that the flight they commanded would be remembered not for its on-time arrival, but for the integrity upheld under pressure. Back in the galley, Karen Mitchell finally placed her clipboard on a side counter and wiped her palms on her skirt. Her uniform, once immaculate, now felt like a straitjacket. Her colleagues avoided her eyes but offered curt nods of acknowledgement. Emily stepped forward last, her hand hovering over Karen's elbow. "You did apologize," she said softly. Karen turned, her eyes wide. "Is that enough?" she asked, voice trembling. Emily's gaze was steady. "Sometimes it's where you begin," she replied, and then turned to tend to the flight deck door. A moment later, the plane's wheels touched down with a gentle thump. The cabin lights brightened as the ground crew signaled readiness. Passengers shuffled in their seats, gathered their belongings, and braced for what might come next. Sergeant Alicia Thompson remained seated, breathing evenly, her face serene. As the jet slowed on the tarmac, the boarding door hissed open. Two uniformed officers from the airline's security detail stepped in, stern, professional, and unyielding. They made their way down the aisle, and the cabin fell into an expectant hush once more. From behind them walked Commander Robert Thompson, Alicia's father, his own dress uniform impeccable, medals polished, his expression composed but resolute. His presence filled the aisle like the opening of a curtain on a serious drama. Passengers rose to their feet as the officers reached Alicia's row. One of them spoke into his radio, brief and clipped, then turned to Alicia. "Sergeant Thompson, sir," he said with a respectful nod. Alicia stood, stiff-backed and poised. Commander Thompson cut a dignified figure beside her. He glanced toward Karen Mitchell, who stood frozen near the galley entrance. "Sergeant Thompson," her father addressed her in a gentle tone, "I see that justice has been served." His eyes softened as he met his daughter's calm gaze. Alicia offered him a slight smile, her pride in his steadiness evident. "Thank you, father," she replied, voice steady as a rifle shot. The lead officer then addressed Karen Mitchell. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, voice firm but not unkind, "you will need to accompany us to the ground operations office. There are some statements to take." Karen's eyes widened, but she nodded, surrendering without protest. The cabin watched as she followed the officers out, her head bowed, her uniform now a reminder of a moment that irreparably changed her career. As the last of the crew exited, Commander Thompson turned back to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice carrying with the calm authority of a man used to command, "thank you for your patience today. Sergeant Thompson is a dedicated service member who deserves the respect we afford all those who wear the uniform. Let us carry forward that respect in our daily lives." A soft round of applause emerged from the cabin, tentative at first, then growing in sincerity. Alicia felt a warmth spread through her chest as she looked at faces that only moments before had ignored her. The applause swelled until even those in economy joined in, their claps echoing like a tide washing over the cabin. When the noise subsided, Commander Thompson offered one final nod to his daughter. She met his gaze, appreciating how he had handled things with calm precision. Then, together, they stepped off the plane into the cool evening air of the tarmac. Flashbulbs popped from media cameras waiting just beyond the jet bridge, a testament to how a single moment of prejudice had ignited headlines and sparked conversations nationwide. As she descended the stairs, Alicia felt the rush of cameras and onlookers, but she kept her composure. She walked beside her father, her boots clicking against the metal steps, proud that she had stood tall in the face of injustice. Karen Mitchell's fate would be decided by her employer, but for Alicia, this was more than a personal victory. It was a statement that respect cannot be bargained away, that silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity, and that one voice, steady, resolute, can shift the course of an entire cabin. By the time she reached the jet bridge floor, a crowd of reporters and passengers lined the corridor. The roar of questions and camera shutters formed a backdrop to her thoughts. She gave a short press statement, courteous, brief, unflinching. She spoke of service, dignity, and the importance of standing up when wrongs are done. When the final question was asked and the flashes dimmed, Alicia allowed herself a true smile. She turned to her father, and together they walked toward the waiting car, the night air cool against their faces. Behind them, the cabin door closed, sealing a story that would be retold as an example of courage and the sweet justice that follows when one refuses to be silenced. In the days that followed, media outlets replayed the footage of Karen Mitchell's hesitant apology, the hush of the cabin, the quiet strength of Sergeant Alicia Thompson as she reclaimed her seat, and her father's dignified intervention. Social media brimmed with discussions about respect, discrimination, and the power of speaking out. Alicia received letters of gratitude from veterans, from strangers, from young people who found inspiration in her steadiness. Through it all, she remembered the tight leather of that first-class seat, the weight of dozens of eyes, and the sting of a hand on her arm that tried to push her back. But most of all, she remembered how she stood, how the cabin fell silent, and how justice arrived not with fury, but with calm resolve. That was the moment her story truly took flight, far beyond the confines of a single plane, carried on the wings of dignity restored. Sergeant Alicia Thompson could feel every eye in the cabin turning toward her as she rose from her seat. The hush that settled over the plane was heavier than the thunder of combat she had weathered overseas. Her uniform felt suffocating, the crisp olive-green fabric suddenly too tight around her shoulders. She fought the urge to rub at her collar and instead kept her chin level, her boots clicking firmly on the aisle carpet with each step toward first class. Karen Mitchell hovered near the galley, arms folded, her posture rigid as a drill instructor's. Emily Carter stood to one side, watching Karen's approach with a mixture of guilt and relief. No one spoke. No one offered to help Alicia, though several passengers stared with wide eyes. The silence stretched out, broken only by the faint clink of an ice cube in Karen's glass. At seat 3A, Karen cleared her throat. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, crouching so her voice would carry but not boom. "It appears there was a misunderstanding." Her words trembled on the edge of an apology but lacked conviction. Alicia paused at the armrest, folding her hands neatly in her lap. her lips curved in a polite but unyielding half-smile. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "You told me I didn't belong here, and you touched my arm." The ripples of that statement spread through the cabin. A man in the front row lowered his magazine. A woman 2 rows back set down her champagne flute. Even the flight attendants on the other side of the curtain leaned in to listen. Karen swallowed. "I'm sorry," she began, voice wavering. "I misread the manifest. Your ticket did match your seat assignment." She stopped as a hush deeper than any spoken word fell around them. Alicia rose, her clean crease of skirt brushing the edge of the seat. She did not say thank you. She did not say you're forgiven. She simply turned and walked past Karen, her stride unhurried but resolute, retracing the path she had been forced to take earlier. The first-class passengers who had turned their backs when she was humiliated now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few yoked their expressions into masks of contrition. Alicia settled back into 3A, tucking her backpack under the seat just as she had before. Karen hovered briefly behind her, mouth opening and closing like a guppy. "If there is anything I can do for you, please let me know," she said at last, voice small. AC offered a slight nod, then opened the little hard-covered book in her lap. She did not read. Her eyes were fixed on the blank space between words, absorbing the silence that spoke far louder than any apology. Karen retreated to the galley, her skin pale and her hands damp. Emily Carter met her gaze and gave a small nod. Nothing needed to be said. Emily turned her back and busied herself with trays, but Karen remained frozen, caught by the weight of 1,000 judgments. Sergeant Thompson sat motionless in her seat, the gentle hum of the engines a distant echo. Then her phone vibrated. "Dad, they're at the gate. Wait for them," the message read. She tucked the phone into her jacket pocket and exhaled, the breath she had been holding since Karen's approach finally releasing. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we have come to a complete stop." The routine announcement felt like a formality, a thin veil over the electricity crackling through the cabin. Outside, the plane's wheels touched down with a smooth thud, the reverse thrust rattling the fuselage gently. A handful of passengers offered polite applause, but it lacked warmth. It was the sound of relief tinted with uncertainty. No one truly knew what would happen next. A few minutes later, the plane eased to a stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign clicked off and Hush turned to cautious motion. A woman near the window leaned over and whispered to her husband. His reply was inaudible but nodded vigorously. A man 2 rows ahead in the aisle reached up to grab his carry-on, but Sergeant Thompson remained seated, composed. Her father's instructions were clear: remain seated. Let them come to you. A figure appeared at the front door, a tall man in a dark suit, an airline badge clipped to his lapel. His shoulders were broad, his expression unreadable. He stepped through the cabin door without a glance at the crowd, his eyes locked on Karen Mitchell, who was standing stiffly in the galley. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm but polite, "you'll need to come with us." His tone carried the finality of a court order. Karen's mouth fell open, but the words would not come. The officer repeated himself. "There has been a formal complaint and federal notification of misconduct during this flight. You will be escorted for questioning immediately." A stunned gasp rippled through the cabin. A passenger in the front stood up with a phone in hand, pretending to check a message as the camera lens slid into place. Karen's eyes flicked around, pleading silently for someone to intervene. But everyone remained silent, eyes lowered or fixed elsewhere. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped into the aisle. Each footfall sounded an alarm in her mind. The carpeted floor felt as though it were swallowing her whole. She passed Sergeant Thompson's seat, and their eyes met. Alicia's gaze was steady, unshaken. That look held more weight than any apology could ever carry. Karen looked down and hurried on, She disappeared through the cabin door. The cabin door closed behind her with a click, and the moment the latch engaged, the entire plane exhaled. Seats shifted, bags were clutched, and whispered conversations ignited in the suddenly crowded aisle. But Sergeant Thompson stayed seated. She felt no urge to stand. She felt no relief. She only felt the clarity of justice served. Part 2. A mile down the jet bridge, the hush of the gate area felt foreign after the controlled chaos inside. Passengers filed off the plane, their faces a mixture of curiosity, relief, and lingering guilt. A man in seat 3C, the one who had stared at his screen throughout the ordeal, paused at the door and turned back. He stepped toward Alicia, his suitcase wheels clicking. "I didn't know you were someone important," he murmured, voice low enough not to carry. He stopped a step short of her seat. "I just saw a soldier with a first-class ticket. I didn't mean to judge." Alicia met his gaze, her expression softening just a fraction. "I'm not important," she replied evenly. "I just had a valid ticket." He looked down, shame coloring his cheeks. "I didn't intend it that way." He shrugged, trying to make light, but the tension remained in his posture. "I guess people see what they expect to see." She studied him for a moment. "That is how it goes," she said quietly. "Your worth is more than what someone assumes. It only becomes real when someone else cares about it." He nodded, as though that truth sank into his bones. He picked up his bag and moved on, leaving Alicia alone with the low murmur of departing travelers. Emily Carter appeared beside her seat, stepping quickly so she didn't draw attention. "They've cleared the exit," she said softly. "You're welcome to deplane when you're ready." Alicia stood and gathered her belongings. She tugged her backpack straps into place. "Are there still officers waiting?" Emily nodded. "2 security officers and a representative from the airline's executive response team. They're not here to question you. They'll guide you and help with anything you need." She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, voice steady. "I just need a way out." Emily paused, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I saw how she treated you and I froze. I should have spoken up." Alicia offered a small, understanding nod. "Now you know how it feels," she said. Her tone was gentle but firm, the same tone she used with new recruits in basic training. Emily swallowed and stepped back toward the galley, head lowered but dignity intact. Alicia moved down the aisle, passing the first-class seats where passengers had once ignored her, their faces now turned away or looked apologetic. No one spoke. She reached the jet bridge and stepped into the terminal, the familiar fluorescent lights seeming too bright after the dim cabin. At the end of the bridge stood 2 uniformed security officers, their badges gleaming. Beside them was a man in a navy blue suit with a silver airline pin on his lapel. His posture was upright, professional, respectful. "Sergeant Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "I'm David Larson from the airline's executive response team. We've been made aware of what happened. Commander Thompson has asked for complete transparency and accountability. I would like to escort you to the executive lounge where he is waiting." Alicia met his handshake with a firm grip. "Lead the way," she said. They walked through the terminal. Store clerks and passengers gave them a wide berth, sensing the gravity of the moment. Some whispered as they passed, "Is that her?" "Yeah, I saw her on the flight." Their voices trailed off. They reached a pair of frosted glass doors labeled Executive Lounge, private access only. Larson paused before pushing them open. Beyond, the corridor fell silent. The click of their shoes on the polished floor echoed. At the end of the hallway was a set of double doors. On the left side, a narrow plaque read, "Executive Lounge, Guests and VIPs." Larson motioned Alicia forward. "Your father is inside," he said. "If you need legal assistance, it's available. We can also provide a written statement if you wish." Alicia nodded and pushed the door open. continue seamlessly into the next part of the narrative. Sergeant Alicia Thompson paused just inside the executive lounge doorway, the afternoon light behind her softening the edges of her uniform, yet doing nothing to diminish the resolve in her posture. Her father, Commander Robert Thompson, sat in a high-back leather chair, the black folder now closed, resting on the dark wood side table by his elbow. He rose as she stepped forward, his polished shoes settling upon the thick carpet with deliberate quiet. "Alicia?" he said, voice low but carrying that unmistakable military calm. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair opposite him. Alicia crossed the room in a few confident strides and lowered herself into the chair. The leather was cool beneath her uniform skirt, and she let the firmness support her spine. Commander Thompson sat back down and folded his hands over his knee. "I've read the full report," he began, "and I could not be more proud. You handled yourself with dignity under pressure few civilians or even trained soldiers could match." Alicia met his gaze. "I had to make sure our service members won't face this again," she said quietly. "It wasn't just me in that cabin. It could have been any one of the women in our ranks." He nodded. "I understand. That is why I asked them to bring you here, not just for an apology, but to shape policy." He leaned forward, voice earnest. "They want your input on bias training, manifest procedures, bystander empowerment, even cabin design. Airlines across the nation will be revising their protocols because of this." Alicia inhaled slowly, the weight of responsibility familiar from deployments. "Then let's get to work," she said. Shortly after, David Larson and Karen Blake from Human Resources entered with a small tray holding 2 crystal glasses of iced tea. They set it on the side table and waited. Alicia took one, letting the cool condensation slip through her fingers. She sipped before speaking again. "I want a written commitment that all flight attendants must verify both ticket and identification, not just glance at a uniform," she said. "And that any passenger, military or civilian, who feels discriminated against has a direct hotline to corporate with guaranteed follow-up." Karen Blake nodded and jotted notes on her tablet. "We will draft a new passenger service policy by week's end," she said. "It will include explicit checklists, mandatory bias awareness workshops, and a passenger feedback loop that triggers a managerial review within 24 hours. Alicia set down her glass. "Good. And I'd like an annual public report, nothing buried in legalese, to track complaints and resolutions." Larson raised his hand in a gesture of agreement. "That transparency is essential. We'll post it on our website and share with the Department of Transportation." Commander Thompson folded his arms, eyes bright with pride. "You are making a difference," he said. "Your resilience in that cabin turned a personal affront into systemic reform." Alicia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "It felt like the fight in Fallujah," she admitted. "Only this time, the battlefield was cabin 3A at 35,000 feet. They shared a quiet laugh. Then Alicia rose. "I'm ready to go home now," she said. Her father stood and offered her his arm. She linked her elbow into his, and together they exited the lounge, where the executive team stood back respectfully, leaving them a clear path. Outside, the airport corridors were alive with motion. Families reunited, business travelers hurrying to connections, children tugging teddy bears. Yet the throng parted for them as if instinctively aware of their rank and purpose. Airline employees lined the walls, offering nods of respect. A young gate agent paused in his paperwork to salute both officer and daughter of the regiment. They reached the curb where a black SUV idled. Before they entered, Alicia turned to her father. "Thank you for trusting me to handle it," she said softly. She understood that his role could easily have overshadowed hers, but he had given her the space to reclaim her own voice. He nodded. "Always," he replied. "You are your own best advocate." The SUV doors closed, and the vehicle glided away from the terminal, merging onto the boulevard lined with magnolia trees whose white blossoms glowed in the fading light. Alicia watched the city skyline come into view, steel towers reflecting gold from the setting sun. She thought of her comrades still deployed overseas, and of the countless veterans who had carried indignities heavier than luggage. She resolved that this victory would stand as a beacon for them too. That evening, Alicia returned to her childhood home, greeted by the gentle arms of her mother and the excited chatter of her younger brother Michael. In the kitchen, the long pine table was set with care, white plates edged in blue lace, crystal water goblets, a pitcher of sweet tea, and Mary Thompson's famous cornbread, still warm from the oven. They sat down and the clink of silverware began a symphony of comfort. Mary poured iced tea for everyone. Commander Thompson offered grace, thanking them for their service to country and family. Conversation flowed. Michael's plans for the fall semester, Mary's book club gossip, but always beneath it all lay the quiet pride. Alicia described the day's meetings, the trained restraint of Karen Mitchell as she faced accountability, the coin presentation, the policies drafted. Each emotion she had felt, the sting of humiliation, the fire of righteous anger, the relief of vindication. She shared as though narrating a tactical operation. Michael listened wide-eyed. "I can't imagine being treated like that," he said. He paused, then added, "But Dad says what you did will protect guys like me when we're out there. That means everything." Alicia met his gaze across the table. "It does," she agreed. "Every uniform deserves respect, no matter where they are or what they look like." Mary reached across and squeezed her hand. "You taught us that dignity is non-negotiable," she said. Commander Thompson set down his glass and looked around at his family. "To dignity," he toasted. Glasses lifted, and their smiles met like a shield of light. Over the next days, Serena Airlines' public apology appeared in national newspapers and on evening news broadcasts. A primetime news anchor recapped Flight 227's injustice, emphasizing how a single sergeant's calm resolve had sparked meaningful reform. Social media campaigns under Seat of Respect and Thompson Stands trended. Veteran advocacy groups praised her, civilian organizations hailed the airline's accountability, and military spouses sent letters thanking her for standing up for all uniformed personnel. Alicia returned calls from advocacy groups, offered interviews to local students, and worked with the airline's training department to craft interactive bias workshops, featuring video reenactments of her experience. She recorded a voicemail greeting for the airline's new passenger hotline, her voice firm but welcoming. "You belong here. We are listening." One morning, she received an email invitation to speak at the National Aviation Conference alongside the Secretary of Transportation. Another asked her to address a symposium on diversity at a major university. Invitations kept arriving. Airport security seminars, corporate leadership retreats, even an appearance on a national talk show. Through it all, she kept her focus on the people who needed a voice most. Service members overseas, older passengers who felt invisible, anyone pushed aside by assumption or ignorance. Months later, Alicia stood at a podium in a grand hotel ballroom before a sea of airline executives, union representatives, government officials, and fellow service members. The banners read, "Aviation for all, respect at every altitude." She looked out at their faces, some nervous, some skeptical, and took a steady breath. "Good morning," she began in clear, conversational tones. "I'm Sergeant Alicia Thompson, and I was once told I didn't belong in first class." That moment stung, but it also taught me something powerful. Dignity is not a privilege, it's a fundamental right. She paused, letting the statement settle. When you choose to look beyond uniform or skin color, you acknowledge the humanity that connects us all. Today, I challenge you to make respect your standard operating procedure. As she spoke, sharing anecdotes, policy recommendations, and genuine humor, the audience leaned in. They laughed at her jokes about tiny airplane seats, they furrowed their brows at sobering statistics, and they applauded when she called out the need for concrete accountability measures. By the end, many had tears in their eyes, and when she concluded with, "May every passenger feel seen and every crew member feel heard," the standing ovation rang like a salute. Afterward, executives approached her with handshakes and heartfelt thanks. One airline CEO admitted he had underestimated the impact of everyday kindness. A veteran-led nonprofit asked her to chair a committee on in-flight discrimination. Students and interns lined up for selfies. Some veterans, some civilians touched by her story. Through it all, Alicia remained grounded. She knew the real work would continue long after the applause faded, monitoring the hotline's effectiveness, refining training curricula, ensuring follow-through on every policy. But she felt ready. She had faced down silence and prejudice at 35,000 feet and had emerged with her dignity, her voice, and a path forward for countless others. A year later, Sergeant Alicia Thompson found herself back at the Georgia Regional Airport, not as a passenger but as a keynote speaker for an inclusive travel summit. The terminal's familiar hum felt like an old friend, and as she walked through security, her coin gleaming on her lanyard, the cheers of supporters echoing behind her, she realized just how far she had traveled from that humiliating moment on Flight 227. No longer was she the quiet soldier moved to the back. She was the advocate, the catalyst for change, the voice of respect that soared above every whisper of prejudice, and as she stepped onto the stage, the crowd rose in applause. She lifted her hand in a calm salute, and she knew without doubt that dignity had taken flight and would remain airborne for all who refused to be silenced. Sergeant Alicia Thompson pushed open the heavy double doors of the executive lounge and felt a familiar mix of calm and determination. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the subtle scent of polished mahogany, and the low murmur of staff in tailored navy blazers seemed to envelop her like a shield. At the far end of the room, seated behind a sleek glass coffee table, was her father, Commander Robert Thompson. He rose as she entered, closing his eyes for just a heartbeat in silent pride before nodding once and opening his arms. Alicia crossed the room in measured steps, her boots clicking on the plush carpet, and he welcomed her into a firm, brief embrace. "You okay?" His voice rumbled, low and steady. Alicia drew in a deep breath, then exhaled. "I am now," she replied, settling into the leather chair opposite him, her uniform crisp and immaculate, even after hours of turmoil. She placed her backpack at her feet and fixed him with a direct gaze. "I read the report, Dad," she began. "I saw the footage. Someone filmed it and already sent it to aviation circles." He tapped a black leather folder on the side table. "I reviewed it myself. The airline's initial response was pathetic, an apology half-hearted enough to fit in a single tweet, a free voucher, and an attempt to sweep it under the rug." He slid the folder across the table. "Everything we need is in here: emails, passenger statements, crew logs, and your boarding pass for seat 3A front and center." Alicia picked up the boarding pass, her fingertips tracing the embossed letters. "She never asked to verify my ticket," she said, voice low but fierce. "She saw my uniform, saw who I was, and decided I didn't belong." He nodded, jaw tight. "She's been suspended pending investigation, but that doesn't go nearly far enough." Alicia arched an eyebrow. "You want her fired?" He shook his head. "No, this is about more than one flight attendant. Firing her quietly just lets her resurface somewhere else. We need systemic change, policy that ensures no one can push a uniformed service member off a seat, or anyone else out of their place, again." She leaned forward. "What kind of change?" Commander Thompson opened the folder and withdrew a set of printed pages. "I've drafted a federal policy proposal. Mandatory bias awareness training for all cabin crew. Dual verification of ticket and photo ID for any seat reassignment request. a confidential Department of Transportation hotline for discrimination complaints with guaranteed response within 72 hours. Civil penalties up to $50,000, 0 cents per violation. Annual public reporting of all complaints and outcomes. Alicia studied the pages. Good, but we need definitions up front. Premium or special security seat must include military uniforms, verified medical and mobility needs, religious or cultural attire, official travel assignments, and documented humanitarian cases. Her father nodded and adjusted the draft accordingly. Agreed. We'll also require airlines to print passenger rights notices on every boarding pass. Clear language about who you are and what recourse you have if moved unjustly. Alicia tapped a pen on the table, eyes bright. And the training must be third-party audited. No airline self-certifies. An independent body delivers and evaluates it annually. He added the note to the document. Perfect. Now, public apology, not just to you, but to every service member who's been humiliated. We'll demand the airline issue a front-page statement in all major newspapers and on their website. Alicia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Make it personal. Reference Sergeant Alicia Thompson's experience. Turn this from a PR stunt into genuine accountability. Her father gathered the document. We'll send this to the Department of Transportation tonight. They'll route it to key sponsors on Capitol Hill, ranking members on Senate Commerce, House Transportation, Veterans Affairs. She rose, resolve burning. And I'll draft talking points. I'll testify personally. He stood, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. You've earned that stage. Meanwhile, across town, Karen Mitchell sat alone in a windowless HR conference room, her uniform-style blazer feeling like a costume she could no longer wear. A single overhead light illuminated the long oak table before her, and on it lay a preliminary notice, investigation pending, potential termination. The words seemed carved in stone. Images of Flight 227 flickered in her mind, the instant she peeked at Alicia's uniform and assumed entitlement. The hush of first class as she crouched to issue her awkward apology, the handcuffs clicking on her wrists as security escorted her out. She realized now that she had treated a soldier, someone who'd served her country for a year overseas, as if she were a trespasser. A polite knock sounded and Karen Blake, the airline's VP of Human Resources, entered with a sympathetic nod. Ms. Mitchell, she began, voice gentle. Thank you for coming in. We wanted you to have the opportunity to respond before finalizing our recommendations. Karen swallowed. I know, I made a terrible mistake, she said, voice wavering. I assumed. I didn't verify. I humiliated a soldier in uniform in front of dozens of passengers. Blake slid a complete dossier across the table. Passenger statements, flight logs, social media posts calling out Serena Airlines for racism, and transcripts of the apology Karen had given. You have 3 days to respond in writing, Blake explained. After that, we will present to corporate counsel. The likely outcome is termination. Karen closed her eyes against the weight of it. She picked up a pen and paper. I accept full responsibility, she wrote slowly. I apologize to Sergeant Alicia Thompson and to all who witnessed my conduct. I will comply with any further training or disciplinary measures imposed. She set the pen down and exhaled, her uniform now a reminder of a disgrace she could not undo. Back in the Thompson study, Alicia and her father worked late into the night, fine-tuning their policy proposal. Each clause they drafted aimed not merely to punish one flight attendant, but to erect safeguards against prejudice across the entire industry. Their final draft, nearly 20 pages of clear, enforceable language, covered definitions, enforcement mechanisms, funding for training programs, and passenger rights advisories. At 2 a.m., Commander Thompson closed his laptop. We'll present this to Senator Elaine Whitman tomorrow. She's chair of the Aviation Subcommittee and a veteran advocate. She'll champion it. Alicia rubbed her eyes but smiled. "Then we'll testify together." He stood and offered a proud nod. Together. The following afternoon, a crowded media room at Atlanta Hartsfield was packed with reporters, cameras, and airline staff. A banner proclaimed Air Travel Dignity Act, respect at every altitude. Alicia stepped to the podium in her service uniform. Her father joined her, medals gleaming. Flashbulbs popped, microphones jostled. "Good afternoon," Alicia began, voice steady and clear. "I'm Sergeant Alicia Thompson. On Flight 227, I was removed from my first-class seat, based purely on assumptions about my uniform and my race. That injustice sparked a movement." She paused, scanning the room. "Today we introduce the Air Travel Dignity Act to mandate bias training, dual verification of ticket and ID, and a confidential DOT hotline. Discrimination will no longer be dismissed as error or miscommunication. It will carry real consequences." The room erupted in applause as cameras clicked furiously. Commander Thompson stepped forward. "My daughter represented every service member who's ever felt invisible or unwelcome," he said. "It's time for Congress and every airline to commit to respect." The applause still echoed in the terminal's media room as Alicia and her father stepped away from the podium. Cameras clicked around them and microphones were thrust toward their faces, but they moved calmly through the crowd, heads held high. Later that afternoon, Senator Elaine Whitman announced that she would introduce the Air Travel Dignity Act in the Senate Commerce Committee. Alicia watched from the gallery as committee staffers lined up to thank her personally, some tearing up as they spoke of their own family members in uniform. It felt surreal to see policy begin at her fingertips. Over the following weeks, Alicia and Commander Thompson provided testimony at both House and Senate hearings. Alicia spoke first, recounting the exact moment Karen Mitchell had told her she did not belong, describing the hush in first class that had sealed her humiliation, and then the powerful silence that followed when justice arrived. Her words were clear and measured, and many lawmakers wiped their eyes as she called for dignity on every flight. She urged them to imagine themselves in her seat, feeling the sting of exclusion and the strength that comes from standing one's ground. Her father followed with technical detail, explaining the draft's definitions, enforcement mechanisms, and funding for independent bias audits. He described how the proposed hotline would operate under the Department of Transportation, how civil penalties would be levied, and how annual public reporting would drive accountability. Their teamwork impressed members on both sides of the aisle. Afterward, several representatives and senators approached them with handshakes and nods of commitment. The bill moved swiftly through committee, fueled by bipartisan support. Veterans organizations, disability rights advocates, faith leaders, and airline consumer groups all submitted letters in favor. 1 week later, the Senate voted 89-9 to pass the measure. Alicia watched the roll call on her tablet, her heart pounding as each name was called. When the vote was announced, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent thank you to every service member and airline passenger who had ever been judged unfairly. The House passed it by a similar margin 2 days later. With both chambers in agreement, the Air Travel Dignity Act was sent to the president's desk. On a crisp morning under a bright blue sky at the White House South Portico, Alicia and Robert Thompson stood side by side in the front row as the president signed the law. When the pen reached the signature line, Alicia felt its weight in her hand. Flashbulbs burst, reporters cheered, and veterans in the crowd rose to their feet in salute. She held the pen high and smiled, knowing that her simple act of resolve on Flight 227 had changed the rules for every passenger at 35,000 feet and beyond. Within days of the signing, airlines across the country began revising their procedures. Serena Airlines announced that they had already implemented third-party anti-bias workshops for all cabin crew, launched their confidential discrimination hotline, and installed manifest scan equipment to verify tickets and IDs simultaneously. Other carriers followed suit, reading from the same policy playbook that Alicia and her father had crafted. Airports posted new signage reminding passengers of their rights and featuring a QR code linking to the DOT hotline. Back in her army unit, Alicia was greeted like a hero. Soldiers saluted her in the hangar, and her commanding officer pinned an additional ribbon on her uniform in recognition of her civilian leadership. Veterans in the mess hall praised her courage, and junior enlisted marveled that one of their own had reshaped federal law. Despite the accolades, she remained humble, always redirecting praise to the importance of respect and treating everyone with dignity. One afternoon at the terminal, she boarded a flight in uniform with her regulation duffel bag. At the gate, the agent scanned her ticket and ID as usual, then offered a respectful nod. First-class passengers smiled and welcomed her aboard. Her boots clicked down the aisle without a single side glance. She settled into 3A with a satisfied sigh, buckled her belt, and leaned back. For the first time, the leather seat felt like a genuine sanctuary, rather than a contested territory. Months later, at a major airline industry summit in Chicago, Alicia delivered a keynote address alongside the Secretary of Transportation. The banner behind her read, "Aviation for All." She spoke of the power of individual action to spark systemic change, of the importance of empathy in every cabin aisle, and of the enduring human right to be seen and respected. The summit hall erupted in a standing ovation when she concluded with, "Let every passenger feel seen and every crew member know they are held to the highest standards of humanity." During the Q&A, an airline CEO admitted that prior to Flight 227, they had underestimated the impact of everyday kindness and the cost of unchecked bias. A union representative pledged to include anti-discrimination clauses in every labor contract. Students from law schools and policy centers lined up to ask how they could help refine and expand the law's reach. Alicia answered each question thoughtfully, her calm assurance inspiring everyone in the room. Back at home, holidays brought her and her family together in the backyard under twinkling lights. Commander Thompson grilled burgers, while Mary Thompson set out a spread of salads and cornbread. Michael, now a month into officer training school, spoke of how her story had become part of his curriculum. Alicia laughed and ruffled his hair. "Just remember," she told him, "your worth is not determined by someone else's assumptions." Her father raised a glass of iced tea to the family. "To Sergeant Alicia Thompson," he toasted, "may your story remind us always to honor the dignity in each person, whether they wear a uniform or not." Alicia lifted her glass, reflecting on how far they had come. "And to every passenger and crew member who will never forget that respect is the seat everyone deserves." Years later, as a civilian veteran advocate, Alicia would travel the world speaking at conferences, advising airlines, and mentoring young service members. She would see cabin crews pause to salute her, and children ask for selfies, wide-eyed at the woman who had challenged an entire industry. But no matter the applause or the headlines, she never forgot the hush of that first-class cabin, or the fierce clarity that had driven her to act. In the end, the real victory lived in the everyday moments. The flight attendant who now carefully checked both ticket and ID before asking a passenger to relocate. The elderly woman who felt empowered to speak up when she witnessed unfair treatment. The veteran who boarded in uniform and felt a genuine welcome. That was the legacy of Flight 227, a quiet revolution that ensured the skies would no longer be a place of silent judgment, but a space of shared respect. And so Sergeant Alicia Thompson's story reached far beyond the confines of a single flight. It became a testament to the power of steadfast resolve, to the importance of structural change, and to the unwavering truth that dignity is not a privilege. It is a right that binds us all together, wherever we may fly. Sergeant Alicia Thompson settled into the armchair next to her father, Commander Robert Thompson, and let out a quiet laugh that lacked any real amusement. "So they still won't say my name," she murmured, scanning the headlines flickering on the muted television across the room. "They think vague words buy them time," her father said bluntly. He tapped the legal pad beside him. "But you won't let them hide behind that." Alicia reached for the pen, feeling its weight in her hand, her eyes fixed on the blank lines like a runway waiting for takeoff. "What do you want me to write?" she asked. "Not what I want," he replied, voice calm but firm, "but what has to be said." Alicia drew in a steady breath and began. Mandatory policy enforcement against discriminatory passenger handling. No airline employee shall remove, relocate, question, or physically direct any passenger with a valid ticket based solely on appearance, attire, or assumption of status. All removals must be preceded by digital verification of passenger identity and ticket status, documented in internal flight logs and validated by a second crew member. Her pen moved confidently across the page as she added, "Any breach of procedure, whether deliberate or accidental, will trigger immediate review by an independent ethics board. Additional safeguards shall protect military personnel, individuals with visible disabilities, and those traveling alone in premium seating." They spent the next 3 hours refining every sentence of her statement. There would be no flowery language or vague apologies, only unflinching honesty. By midday, they were ready. That afternoon, a local veterans group hosted a modest press conference in a conference room near the airport. A folding podium stood in front of 20 chairs, occupied by journalists, bloggers, and a handful of active duty officers. Backstage, Alicia changed out of her uniform jacket into a simple dark blazer and jeans. She wanted to be seen as herself. No medals, no regalia. When someone jumps to conclusions about who deserves a seat, it's not just a misunderstanding, it's a judgment, and it's dangerous. This happens not only to soldiers, but to anyone traveling while black, while brown, those with disabilities, those who are quiet or who stand tall. Her gaze swept the audience. "I am raising my voice not only for myself, but for every person who felt too afraid to speak up." She paused, letting her words settle. "I already received an apology. What I want now is accountability. I want clear policy. Mandatory identity verification before any seat change, bias training for every crew member, a confidential hotline for passengers to report discrimination without being labeled difficult, and I want a public pledge from every airline that the next time someone doesn't fit in, they will check their assumptions first." When she finished, the room remained silent for a heartbeat, an acknowledgement that they had witnessed something genuine and necessary. Then applause rose, tentative at first, then building into a robust ovation. Gracefully, Alicia stepped back from the podium as Commander Thompson joined her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Over the next 24 hours, her speech went viral. Video clips amassed millions of views, and hashtags like "You belong here" and "Thompson stands" trended nationwide. Messages poured in. Stories of travelers who had faced similar discrimination, educators who planned to include her speech in curriculum, airline employees calling to say they would walk the aisle differently. The day after her speech, Congress invited her to testify before the Transportation Committee on an expedited passenger rights bill modeled on the framework she and her father had drafted. Senators and representatives listened to her eyewitness account and her clear policy recommendations. By week's end, a bipartisan group introduced the Air Travel Respect Act, containing dual ID verification, mandatory bias training with third-party audits, and civil penalties for violations. 6 weeks later, in a Capitol hearing room bathed in afternoon light, the bill passed both chambers with overwhelming support. On a crisp morning in the East Room of the White House, Alicia stood beside her father as the president signed the law. When she held the pen to the paper, the flash of cameras was dizzying, but her resolve remained steady. She had turned her personal fight into a historic change. Months later, back at her army post, fellow soldiers greeted her with proud salutes. In airline terminals nationwide, new signage reminded travelers of their rights, with QR codes linking to the DOT discrimination hotline. Cabin crews conducted regular bias awareness drills based on Alicia's experience. One evening, as she boarded a flight in uniform for a training assignment, the gate agent scanned her ticket and ID with a respectful nod. She walked down the aisle to her first-class seat, and passengers smiled as she passed. Settling into 3A, she exhaled, the leather cushion now a genuine seat of dignity. On her next journey, she traded her uniform for jeans and a simple t-shirt. At gate A12, the agent scanned her boarding pass and photo ID, nodded warmly, and said, "Enjoy seat 2A, Miss Thompson." No quizzes, no second glances. She settled in without disturbance, exhaled, and let the engine's roar become a gentle hum of belonging. Spring emerged with dogwood blossoms and clearer skies, and Flight 227's significance only grew. Alicia's story moved from viral clip to landmark case study. College classrooms debated her speech as an example of silent protest. Airline workshops incorporated her narrative into ethics modules. Passengers from underrepresented backgrounds began to speak up, buoyed by her example. She did not ask for any of this attention, yet she handled it with the same calm resolve she showed on that plane. Then came an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Policy Forum in Washington, D.C., a room filled with executives in tailored suits and regulators with carefully honed talking points. Alicia took the podium in jeans, boots, and a simple blouse. Without notes, she spoke directly. That seat was more than a row number. It was a hard-earned place. I didn't demand it. I belonged there. But someone assumed otherwise. Today, we're not just fixing procedures, we're shifting perceptions. You can train every crew member, but none of it matters until you believe dignity is a right, not a privilege. The room erupted in respectful applause that carried the power of true understanding. That evening, she strolled alone toward the Lincoln Memorial. The city hummed with life, horns, laughter, footsteps. Yet she felt a serene clarity. The reflecting pool mirrored the monument's glow, and she sat on a bench facing the giant carved likeness of Lincoln. She remembered the touch on her arm that day on Flight 227. A small, dismissive gesture that threatened to erase her place. Instead, she turned silence into strength. By choosing to speak, she refused to let that moment define her. As flags fluttered in the breeze and the water rippled softly, Alicia realized something profound. She had seized what no uniform or medal could give her: the recognition of her own worth and the power to protect it for others. She rose, breathing in the night air, determined that once someone glanced at her and assumed she didn't belong, they would think twice next time. Her story was over only in its beginning. Wherever an airline cabin hummed at 35,000 feet, passengers and crew would remember that Sergeant Alicia Thompson belonged, no seat number required,